Sarah Luttrell. I'm the Events and Communications Manager at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I look forward to today's discussion about the impacts of COVID-19 on education systems. The format for today's discussion, as usual, is going to be a 20 to 25-minute presentation with leaving around 15 minutes for Q&A. And during the question and answer session, we just ask that you submit your questions either directly into the chat or using the raise your hand function. Our CID student ambassador, Manoj Kumar, is going to be moderating the Q&A. We are also going to be recording today's session, and the video of this event will be available on CID's YouTube channel. I will also add links to the chat to sign up for our newsletter and our social media channels, so you can hear more about upcoming events like this. Speaking of that, our next CID Speaker Series panel event is on Friday, April 23rd. And this is on the World Bank's new Fragility and Conflict Report. This report is titled "On the Front Lines of the Fight Against Poverty." So we hope that you'll join us for that exciting event as well. But without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Priya Joshi. So Priya is a Senior Project Officer of Research working on the Global Education Monitoring Report team at UNESCO. She has been working with the team since 2014, leading and contributing on non-state actors in education and the role of education in other development outcomes, such as gender equality and inclusive cities. Her background is in education policy, economics, and public policy. She has a PhD in education policy from the University of Pennsylvania and has previously worked with organizations such as the IMF, UNICEF, and the World Bank. So thank you for being here today, Priya, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Let me share my screen now. Have you, is it available? Can you everyone see it?
Yes, looks great.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Sarah, for inviting me for the CID Speaker Series, and really thank you everyone who's listening in. I'm Priya Joshi from the GEM team. Today I'll be speaking on the effects of COVID-19 on education systems from the perspective of the GEM report. As a global evolving crisis, it has been a truly global collective effort to assess the situation. And of course, the story is not set yet. I will give you a brief introduction to the GEM report, move on to the COVID-19 discussion, and end with a bit of focus on Nepal, my home country. So the GEM report has been around since the EFA MDG era and has lasted into the SDG era. Just a sea of acronyms here, but to just note that we've been around since 2002. It was developed as the monitoring mechanism for the Education for All global agenda in education, which was coinciding with the Millennium Development Goals agenda. And since 2016, in the Global Sustainable Development Goals era, we have been rebranded as the Global Education Monitoring Report, or the GEM report. We have captured various issues since 2016. We looked at education's linkages with other sustainable development goals in 2016 and defined the monitoring framework for the next 15 years. We looked at accountability in education, viewing it as a shared responsibility across all actors to fulfill our commitments. When we looked at migration and displacement, we emphasized the need to build bridges in and through education. When we looked at inclusion and education, we have highlighted the need for a truly inclusive approach that takes all into that, that builds on the ambitions of equity, but really tries to achieve an inclusive approach. We are an evidence-based report. We've been hosted and published by UNESCO since 2002. It is a privilege to be an editorially independent report, but also essential for our responsibility to monitor objectively and report on education progress, as well as hold all relevant partners to account. If you want to learn more about us and our evolution, you can check out the GEM report strategy in 2019 to 2024 on the website. We, just to briefly say that, the key focus areas are monitoring of SDG 4 and its indicators. There's generally a strong finance discussion. We think about education's role in development. We have engagement in monitoring policy. We have a focus on themes. As I mentioned earlier, it's typically a descriptive, analytical, and a critical take on pressing global issues. There's a consistent focus on equity, on who's left behind, on gender, and intersecting disadvantages is a persistent focus. There's a series of GEM report resources and policy papers which look at a lot of these equity and quality issues. I wanted to show you this. This is all of the products that we developed for the inclusion report. And the main takeaway I wanted to give here was that in the development of all of these works, we have extensive and external engagement with the researchers as well as institutions. And we are sort of continuing that expansion. Now let me turn to the discussion of COVID-19. Like all of humanity, really, we were also grappling in the international education community to think about the uncertainties around this crisis. There were several coordinated action platforms that were developed, such as the Global Education Coalition, which was launched by UNESCO. The International Network of Education in Emergencies developed a ton of tools and toolkits and resources, building on their decades of knowledge on working in education in emergency contexts. So that was like a big development, let's say, like a volume of development. And in this COVID Zoom life, I guess there has been at least a first, a second, a third wave of webinars and blogs and research and opinion. And essentially, I would say that they're focused on documenting the evolving situation, the evolving uncertain situation. There's been a research on the likely short and long-term impacts. And now I think finally slightly trickling into new research actually based on COVID data. And of course, a sea of policy opinions, guidelines on how to maintain education continuity, how to build resilience, and also build back better. So, different kinds of rhetorics, different kind of opinions, and also a focus on distance learning in the system. It cannot really be overstated how much of a global crisis this was and still is. A year later, more than 1.6 billion children have lost instructional time for many months at a time, if not for much of the last year. And many children are still not back in school. And UNESCO continues to monitor the extent of school closures, on their website and is tracking it significantly. Before going into some of the specifics, is just to appreciate that a lot of tough decisions have had to be made, and in a continually evolving situation. Whether like schools and systems have had to decide whether to continue, whether to reopen, what kinds of hybrid models are feasible. The challenge of reopening equitably was a big question mark, is a big question mark. How do you support teachers and parents? What does it mean? There's so many sort of elements of coordination and management, given the sort of roles that schools play beyond just academic learning. Schools have had to think about social-emotional health, mental health, social protection functions of schooling. So many kids are going hungry during school closure periods. And there's also, quite a bit of discussion around whether we should really be redesigning the school system completely now. Especially I think around this question of learning from home, the use of hybrid models. And the GEM report, just to give you a process point. In March of 2020, we were finalizing our inclusion report. We're in the middle of sharing the conceptualization of the non-state actors report. In February and March, I was in India and then South Africa, discussing this report. And then we had agreed with the advisory board that the forthcoming report would be on technology. It's an unfortunate coincidence, but as you can imagine, these are very relevant issues to think through for COVID. Since then, the COVID perspective has become interwoven in our ongoing thematic report development and in the monitoring, of the situation. I wanted to highlight equity and inclusion issues that we've thought through, starting with the fact that the world was not equitable before COVID-19. It was neither equitable between countries. If you look at just the data that we have produced recently on secondary completion rates, clear income level disparities. The secondary completion rates are currently only like 19% in low income countries and 88% in high income countries. And of course, clear disparities within countries. If you look at in Italy, there's like a 40% gap between the richest girls and poorest girls in secondary completion in 2017. And if you look at that initial data of access to devices and internet and etc., that seemed so relevant, you'll find that, again, the story continues, large disparities even in rich countries like Canada. Rural broadband access is much lower than urban broadband access. Even sort of the lower tech options like radio and TV, it is just so low, especially among the poorest 20% in many, many countries. And the access to internet at home, I guess, also would sort of is kind of evident, I guess. Technology was previously seen as an essential part of the education experience, only for some students and teachers, and mostly at the upper secondary level. But even if you look at these wealthier countries, like in 11 countries, including Germany, Republic of Korea, and Uruguay, at most 1 in 4 grade 8 students were reported using ICTs weekly in or outside of school. In 2018, head teachers reported that only 5 in 10 teachers had the technical and pedagogical skills to integrate digital devices in instruction in the Netherlands. So this is the situation we were in pre-COVID. And of course, these pre-existing inequalities fed into the unprecedented COVID crisis. And one of the questions we have to ask is whether governments were able to apply the do no harm principle, that is, not put in place programs that would actively risk harming people. Overall, I would say, as a preview, that unfortunately it seems that many solutions that were tried posed a risk of leaving many children further behind. So education systems responded with distance learning, which really was an imperfect substitute. School closures affected many disadvantaged learners who benefited from support systems like school meals and psychological support. The pace of change expected from teachers and parents was overwhelming, which they couldn't deal with it because of their home environment, but also the capacities to really engage in schooling. So really a plethora of issues. As a monitoring report, of course, we think a lot about the data, and we're monitoring the situation. And all I can say to you is that the data and analysis situation are evolving. Data collection systems, of course, were challenged. Various data sources are now in place, each shedding different lights. Lots of research is also, ongoing. If you look at the earliest administrative data, it shows that 1 in 5 countries had no plans to continue learning. So that in the early sort of couple of months, it affected at least 45 million learners. But I think the other important point is that almost half of the primary and secondary students in countries that targeted online platforms did not have access to internet at home. So, while the share of students with no access to internet at home is less than 15% in Western Europe and North America, it is as high as 80% in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. So that was the initial situation, concerns over an overemphasis on online learning. The more recent sort of ministerial data that's coming in from more countries gives us like a bit more general sense of duration of closures, the approaches they're trying, the kinds of remote learning efforts they have in place, online platforms, TV, mobile, take-home materials, and so forth. The graph here sort of shows disparity, right? Again, in an effort to provide household support. If you look at the figure, 66% had subsidized free access to internet in high-income countries, but only 42% in lower middle income countries, and 38% in low-income countries. And similar sort of gaps in terms of teacher supports and teacher psychological supports, or and additional personnel supports. When we look at that is of course like a general sort of administrative data situation. If you look at access, and if you look at household level data, a lot of this has been accomplished through phone surveys. And just a couple of interesting examples from an access and equity perspective. There was a study by the World Bank on Ecuador looking at high school students, where they sort of generally showed that access to remote learning is relatively high. There's access to internet, there's computers and tablets for, let's say, the majority of the population. But when you look at time use data, you see some of these patterns where women, girls and young women are doing more of the household tasks. Male students are working more, but in the afternoon, women are continuing on their tasks, whereas male students have more time for leisure. So there's a higher risk of fatigue for female students, and different kinds of examples there. The poorest are more likely to be working than in education. 36% of the lowest quartile had not done any online learning in the last week. The Center for Global Development is is continuing to observe the situation in Pakistan. In June, they found that during school closures, 2/3 did not use like TV or mobile technology for learning. And of course, richer households are doing more. When we think of quality and learning, there's been a number of opinion surveys on teachers. It's interesting to look at this OECD information on, sorry, not 69, 59 countries, where from April, May, where it just says, you just see that it's a very uncertain situation. I think the teachers are saying it's really impossible to say, like the majority, 60% of the teachers are saying it's impossible to say what the students are really learning effectively or as they used to. The NFER, the National Foundation for Education Research in the UK, has been surveying the situation in the UK. And here, the latest data coming from July 2020 shows that teachers are saying students are at least 3 months behind normal expectations after the lockdown. There's the learning gap between disadvantaged and students and peers actually grew by 56% compared to the situation in July. And this graph here is linked to the differences between deprived and non-deprived schools. Teachers in more deprived schools are more likely to say that students are many months behind. So, like 4 months, 5 months, and 6 months behind in another year. Let's see. In terms of quality and learning and like real, analysis of learning losses, there's a few data points, but I just wanted to point out these two interesting things that are happening. There's a long-term impact sort of discussion linked to projections of scenarios on the RISE website. These two figures are basically, if you choose, the first figure is if you choose that the learning loss, the COVID year was, grade 1, and the second figure is if the COVID year was grade 6, and it's just plotting the cumulative effect by grade 10. So all it's trying to show is that if you lose that year as a young child, you're losing a lot more learning over time because the accumulated loss is probably going to be quite high for you as a younger child versus an older child. There's also recent short-term analysis on the Netherlands, which looks at interesting exams-based data to basically argue that all of the full time that they were locked down, all of it was learning lost, and that is actually quite high for less educated parents. And the way they talk about the case is that Netherlands is a best case scenario. There's equitable funding, there's high resources, there's a very short sort of lockdown. So if you imagine that this is it's a cautionary tale, let's say, of what we are probably going to find in the next year of research. There's a lot of, we have been thinking, and everyone else has been thinking about this financing uncertainty point. There's a policy paper that our finance team has developed on this question of what would it cost to, what kinds of additional costs COVID might add. The main thing here to remember, I guess, is that of course the length of the closure, the GDP loss recovery scenario is what would determine the loss. COVID-19, of course, would in any scenario analysis increase costs because of infrastructure, health, and teacher needs. But the main point that we've been trying to make is that if you spend upfront in remediation, in real re-enrollment strategies, then you're just going to help cut this cost quite a bit. If you look at given that sort of perspective, if you look at the financial responses that have been in place, you find that education is not a major part of stimulus packages. The IMF data from the IMF shows that COVID is the response funding from stimulus packages is amounting to about, let's say, 12 trillion almost, of which only 91 billion is going to education, which is 0.78%, of which I guess more strikingly, 73 billion is going to high income countries, right? So it's like mostly going to high income countries. We also think there's a very strong need to keep track of equity in education financing. Most countries do not have a very clear equity focus in their financing policy. We do see some COVID period adjustments, like Brazil is like using their cash transfers to add to ensure that poorest families have enough food. There's lots of interesting aid for emergency responses. Funding is being used by Sudan, for instance, to purchase radios, to print, to give mobile data to teachers. Papua New Guinea is, providing learning kits and braille materials to students with disabilities. So, lots of emergency type responses are in play. But overall, I would say that the education spending shortfall is of concern for poorer countries. Government spending has declined, is probably declining. Household income declined, and households play a big role in poorer countries in funding education systems. And aid is likely to decline because of if GDP falls. So, and this is all documented in our Education Finance Watch that we've started recently. I just wanted to take you through Nepal. I wrote a blog on Nepal in June of 2020, where I sort of analyzed the early situation. And, lots of economic effects. I don't know if I touched on this, but there was a governance change, like a dramatic governance change from a unitary system to a federal system that was happening in the country. I talked to some colleagues who worked in the education cluster in Nepal, and what she had told me was that Nepal has gone through so many crises, especially the big earthquake crisis of 2015. So there's a lot of lessons that they learned from it. But what is different, of course, is that it's nationwide, it's health, it's linked to contagion type issues. And the concern they had, which I think a lot of other countries have had, is that there's a lack of this home connectivity situation. So what it implies is that online learning can only be one of a big package of other things, radio, TV, accelerated learning, flexible learning approaches. What I had looked at then was that, how do you even begin social distancing, in a context like this, especially if you look at this graph, like province 2 is the poorest in Nepal, and also has like the highest student-teacher ratios, so it's, you don't even know where to begin. And already at that point, there were discussions of these, budgetary shortfalls, recessionary environment, lack of adequate prioritization of education. Since then, of course, the situation has developed. You have a remote learning situation where the ministry has developed a decent learning portal, but we know that internet access is low. There's, I think, a lot of discussion around the fact that mobile penetration is high. There's an opportunity to use radio and TV programs. In November, a school reopening framework was developed. Local governments were allowed to make decisions based on local risk assessment. In January, a learning continuity campaign has been started, which I think focuses on a lot of what we had considered these remediation and real enrollment strategies, right? With public safety discussions, focus on marginalization, use of low tech, parental education. So all of these are, I think, good things that are happening. I wanted to, there was an interesting study that, one of my colleagues and friends has recently done in Nepal. They did a phone survey, again, in the tradition of the other phone surveys, where they spoke to children of grade 3 to 5. And what they found was that the learning access during school closures, 70% of children said they accessed some form of remote learning. 75% of households reported spending some time per week supporting children's learning. Which seems pretty good. And when you look at the data, what you see is that the most common form of remote learning was grade level textbooks, and the mobile education is a distant second. You find these, equities situations, teacher support received less by the poor students, household support provided less by the disadvantaged students, disadvantaged families. But more generally, I think a situation of, of much less than a 5 to 6 hour per day that a school would have provided anyway. Many people have looked at this, and probably look at this and say, well, we need to improve the low-tech situation in Nepal. I just wanted to plug our paper where we talked about the importance of textbooks, because what you have in many countries of the world is they don't even have these textbooks, right? So I feel like a lot of people have jumped to be like, oh, let's try the mobile stuff. But you just have to recognize that the foundational, the textbooks are not there for everyone. So last couple of slides, I promise. The forthcoming reports will continue to maintain a COVID focus. If you think about the role of non-state actors, several things might come to your mind. But for example, low-fee private schools in many countries around the world have had sustainability challenges. Private sector is very involved in the COVID opportunity of technology. Funders have shifted their approaches. Monitoring SDG 4 is a continuing process. It's about analyzing, indicators over time, the disruption, what has been upended, more analysis on learning losses, and the monitoring of continuing global coordination on economic recovery, on education recovery. On the whole, the data is still trickling in on all of the effects. COVID disruptions have likely exacerbated inequalities between countries, within homes. I think there is a gender dimension to it, which we've spoken about elsewhere. And there are several needs to prioritize an inclusive recovery. I emphasize the data analysis here, but I think a good point to make is that a crisis has to be dealt with as one. It is one of the biggest crises ever faced, but it is not the first one, right? So the first step to manage a crisis is to think about the emergency response, learn from previous crises, think about, and plan to reopen like systematically, understand how to envision like a crisis sensitive environment. So, there's lots of ways to, and to localize and recognize pre-COVID situations. I think the two things I've highlighted here is that viewing online learning, you have to view online learning really simply as a part of a multifaceted approach, especially when it comes to lower income countries. That is the reality of the day. And no running away from it. And targeted and adequate financing continues to be a challenge and really relevant need. And thank you. This is the website. This is my email. And I'm happy to continue the conversation now.
Thank you so much, Priyadarshani, for this insightful presentation, highlighting how COVID has affected education globally and particularly in low-income and poor countries. Also, thanks for highlighting Education Financing Watch. That was very insightful, and also showing in the complexity of Nepal. So thanks so much once again. And now we will open up for question answer. So I would look at the audiences here. If you have any question, please raise the blue hand function. You can also post your question in the chat box. So while we are waiting from audience to have a question, Priyadarshani, I have one question.
Sure.
I wanted to understand, has the COVID given an opportunity to learn something that and do something that should have been done much before COVID in education sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because I guess we are so education sector centric, what we find is that there's a lot of the conversation continues, right? People sort of recognize the importance of teachers. People recognize, I think, also the importance of home learning. Like it has always been there. I think what is going to happen now is that the hybrid model, the fact that parents have to really be engaged, is going to get like more of a push than we've always thought that. And I think the research in education has gone back decades now on this point. But I think that is going to get a big push.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. So from the audiences, are there any question? Please raise. Oh, yes, Sarah, please go ahead.
I guess I would like to ask a question as well. On the forthcoming technology report, could you speak a bit more to what the focus of that report, like what kinds of technology is that going to look at?
So I don't know if you got a hint from the way we look at the things. We focus on the breadth. So we will look at all of the technologies, and I feel like COVID actually gave us a head start, because we're really in the very, very initial stages of the planning of the technology report. But I think both to look at the low tech, the high tech, the sort of the online environments, the TV, the mobile, the sort of radio learning, opportunities. But I think we always have like as I said, a descriptive and an analytical and a critical take. And I feel like the critical literature on technology and learning has been that the evidence is quite limited in terms of whether, the extent to which it improves learning, right? So I feel like we'll have to interrogate that. COVID presents an opportunity for us as researchers to really, gather this evidence, like to see what kinds of innovations are being tried, and maybe in a year or so it'll have been evaluated to a certain degree. So I think that's what we're looking at. But to answer you, I think the question is that there's no type of focus. It is a universal report. It talks about all countries, and the breadth of technology will be covered. Yeah.
Thank you. So I see a question from Bansari Kamdar in the chat. Bansari, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Thank you for the great presentation, Priyadarshani. It was really interesting. So one of the things I wanted to ask to you about was the relationship between digital equity and female education, and also how do we make sure that women are not dropping out of education, girls are not dropping out of school.
No, thank you for that really, I think very important question. I do think that, we have always had a big focus on gender in our report. And it was interesting because we are finalizing this celebratory report on 25 years of gender equality progress, and, COVID hit. So then, of course, this like accommodation of what does it mean for, what does COVID do, and we're sort of anticipating a lot of risks. One of which is this digital divide question that, the many countries, women are much likely to own mobile phones. The access to technology is much lower. I think one of the interventions in Afghanistan has tried to direct access, provide directly access to women to target to tablets and devices instead of sort of making it more gender neutral. The digital divide is just one of the questions, of course. The bigger story I think that the international community has been focusing on is the fact that there's the gender equality issue for society, right? So once the lockdown happened, gender norms came back in a bigger way. You have women who really had to take on unpaid care and work. I think it went from, let's say, if women were doing 3 hours of unpaid work at home, it went to 6 hours in some certain contexts. And homeschooling was added to their tasks. So there was like this big challenge there. There's a lot of research on adolescent girls and their vulnerabilities, and some research on, I think, from Ebola, like the Ebola related closures in West Africa, on how this period of disruption sort of increased unwanted pregnancies, early marriages. So I feel like in many crisis contexts this does happen in the more vulnerable countries. And I think one other thing I just wanted to add is there is a lot of intervention on this, but on the boys' side also, there are many countries around the world where there's a lot of boys disengagement. So in the UK, like in some of these data, you start seeing that boys are really disengaging because it is a big problem in many high-income countries, but also in many middle-income countries. So gender is sort of a prism through which we have to look at COVID effects.
Thanks so much. We have another question by Rohit, and then there's another question by Emma in chat box. I'll read it for you later. So Rohit, would you like to go ahead first?
Hi, Dr. Joshi. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful. My question was more at a macro level.
Sure.
Coming out of this crisis, it feels like health spending will naturally increase in a lot of states because it's a pandemic and that's where resources have gone towards. But do you think there's going to be a similar thrust and enough sort of drive at the global aid community as well to mobilize resources towards education following this pandemic, especially given the size of, I guess, what is required to recuperate all the losses from the year?
I guess we're sort of in the thick of it, no? Like we've been doing, well, again, I'm sorry to keep saying the same thing, but COVID is just a big crisis, but a crisis in a line of crises. And there used to be a chart we used to use at the end of the 2015, the GMR, where you showed that, I don't know if you've seen this, but you compare education spending to military spending, and you just have like a chart of tanks, and it's 3 days of military spending around the world would really pay off all of this education financing gap. So our responsibility, and then when I presented it the last time, people were like, oh, this is old and tired, but it's very, I think, still an impact, a very impactful point, right? What does it take? And I fear the risk is that, the advocacy that we do with our research, like we use the research, you develop these costing models, you do, like all of the sort of good thinking behind it. It is, of course, we also have like spaces in these strategic places, but it is very true. I think what you said is very true, that, it has become captured as a health emergency when actually, of course, it is much more. And that is the disappointment, right? And you definitely see it in the education system, that it is like, that's what I think the earlier response I said, it was valued, education and teachers were valued, but were they really in the, when you look at the data and what ended up happening. In Nepal, like I mentioned, people were very critical of the budgetary response on education, and I guess we'll see the next round what people will say. But yeah, so I feel like there's a huge risk on this. I think it's a lot of mobilization, a lot of emergency response stuff that is happening, interesting in emergency response stuff. But the funding, like that envelope has never really reached the levels that it needs to. And I'm not sure. I mean, I feel it's a tricky thing, being in the sector now, like quite, for the last 10 or so years. I feel like a lot of what we say is like, despite the evidence, right? Despite the evidence of cost effectiveness of early prevention through education, despite the evidence of the importance of education for climate change, for gender equality, for what have you, and for COVID recovery for the world, there's a big risk. So that's, I think, the situation we're in. But of course, we press on. And yeah, I think we just need more. Maybe that is the innovation we need. An innovative way of reaching the influential minds, because of course we reach a certain space. But yeah, if you have some ideas on that, that'll be interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Priyadarshani. We have another question here. Could you talk a bit more about how COVID has affected children with different ability, and what are your findings in GEM about that?
So yes, I mean, I think we did a pretty big report on inclusion, and the children with disability were a strong focus in that. One of the, at heart, the principle is that inclusive approaches need to be able to include everyone, and I think generally speaking that means a twin track approach to development, which means that a system actually is transforming to become more inclusive, while at the same time there's targeted attention, right? So what is happening, of course, is many countries and many interventions are being tried with, like, let's say, disability specific, sort of objectives. Like I mentioned that example of Papua New Guinea, and like availability of materials, to study at home, and these sorts of things. But I think it's I think a similar case to what we said earlier, right? The advocacy around education, the advocacy around disability, inclusive education, the advocacy, like it is clear that there are huge risks, and we are still just understanding the extent of the risks associated with this major crisis. But I would say that what is better up for disability inclusion than, let's say, 10 years ago, is that the advocacy, I think, is reaching a crescendo compared to before. And I hope that's okay as a macro answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. And I don't see any hand raised now, and there's no other question in the chat box. So I will pass it over to Sarah. Over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you very much, Manoj, and for your presentation, Priya. I know I personally learned a lot, and I look forward to diving in more to learn about the various reports that you have coming out, and previous reports as well. So everyone, we have our next speaker series on April 23rd. So on the World Bank's new report on fragility and conflict. So we hope that you will join us then. Thanks again, Priya, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.